The Gospel of Mark, chapter 16, tells the story of Jesus' resurrection this way. Mark 16, verse 1. When the Sabbath was past, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so that they might go and anoint him, this being Jesus, of course. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. And they were saying one to another, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance of the tomb?" And looking up, they saw that the stone had been rolled back already. It was very large. And entering the tomb, they saw a young man sitting on the right side, dressed in a white robe, and they were alarmed. And he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He is risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." He is risen. He is risen indeed. Today, we gather on this 4th of April, 2021. We gather in a room, we gather online, and we gather with people all throughout the world to celebrate and remember the truth of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. That 2,000 years ago or so, what happened on a hill called Calvary, Jesus was crucified and he was dead, and they placed him in a tomb, but he did not stay dead. 3 days later, he rose victorious over sin. He rose victorious over the grave. He rose victorious over death, so that every single person from the beginning of time till now, until anything that passes us, who believe on this reality that Jesus came to this earth, he suffered and died and rose again so that we could have a relationship back with God. Anyone who believes that truth will be put back into relationship with God. This is the gospel in its simplest form. This is what they call the good news. But my imagination is this morning that you probably already know that, or you wouldn't be taking the time to come into a room on a Sunday known as the 4th of April and to be around people or to watch online. You probably know this story. My imagination is not only do you know the story, you like the story, and some of us even love the story. But recently I've recognized something, that just because I know something, like something, and love something doesn't mean that I get all the connections to it. A while back, for those of you that know me, you know that maybe it's accurate to say I have a slight obsession with 80s music, right? If you're new here today, you don't know that. There's a lot of things to learn. One of them is that the 80s music was the best music. I'm not even going to argue that. I'll point to it in the Bible somewhere. It's just the way it is. I've already got groaning. Great. But if you know me, you know that's what I believe. And so the truth is I'm indoctrinating my children into that. And they know my car, my music, my radio. That's just how it rolls, folks. I pay the bills, my music. And so they're getting really good at it. And I don't remember how long ago it was, but this moment happened with my eldest. For some reason or another, 80s music was not on the radio. But there was a song that I heard, and I knew it, but not only did I know it, I liked it. And I'd like to even go so far as to say that I loved it. And it wasn't a song from the 80s. It was a very odd moment for me. And some of you know this artist. I'm not necessarily recommending one way or the other, but it was this artist, this guy named Bruno Mars. And as I'm saying how I like this, actually I really love this, my eldest sort of said, "Well, that's not surprising." Now, how the rest of this conversation went, it's a little bit of debate between me and my eldest. She's pretty sure that she wouldn't have said what I remember her saying, that she would have said something like this: "Well, Dad, the reason that you like it is because it sounds a lot like 80s music." What I heard was, the reason that you like it is that it sounds a lot like old people music. That's kind of what I thought I heard. But what she did for me in this moment was connect something that I hadn't connected before, something deeper beyond the song, something deeper beyond the artist, of why I knew something, I liked it, and I loved it. A little over a year ago, our world turned upside down. Things had already been crazy, but we just kind of took it up a notch, right? We dialed it up to 11. And when our world went crazy, it hasn't stopped over the last year. It's brought out some things where we find ourselves today in a room, and some people are watching online, maybe doing it online, but in a room, we're wearing masks, right? And have you noticed how difficult it is to recognize someone you haven't seen in a year when they're wearing a mask? Or is it just me? I mean, it's happened to me already a couple times. I mean, someone walks in and I'm like, oh, I know them, right? Nose is covered. And then if they have glasses and they've been breathing and it's covered up, you can't even see their eyeballs. But now this is at some level normalized behavior. Our world's turned upside down, not just medically, emotionally, once again racially, as we find ourselves again dealing with the sin of racism, looking at our country's looking at it this week again as the trial of Derek Chauvin happens, as we look at what happened to George Floyd. Over and over again, we find reasons to be upset and turned upside down. And I haven't talked about politics yet, just to throw things in there, right? And it strikes me in the middle of everything going crazy, it would be really, really easy, especially in this last year, to begin to think or at least live, whether or not we want to recognize we're thinking it this way, like the darkness had won. But 2,000 years ago on a hill called Calvary, they thought darkness had won, but then came Resurrection Sunday. And on Resurrection Sunday, what we're reminded of today and every day is that darkness does not win, but victory comes from Jesus. Yet too often in our lives, we don't live a victorious life. We miss the connection. We miss the connection between what happened that day and why it matters to now. And this is what I don't want us to do today. I don't want us to miss this connection. I don't want us just to know a story, like a story, maybe even love a story, without seeing the connection and why Jesus' victory is our victory, both for eternity and in life now. So there's some things I want to draw out in our time together today. And the first one is this, is that victory is rooted in Jesus. It was about 6 or 6:30 a.m. or so when these three women came to the tomb to anoint the body of Jesus with spices. And I was thinking about this week. There was a question that came to my mind, and here's it. Here's the question. Why? We say, Brian, didn't you just kind of answer your question? The reason that they came to the tomb was to anoint the body with spices. And I say yes, but my question goes a little bit farther than that. My question goes beyond that, a little bit deeper. This is a question, why did they think they even needed to bring spices? Because he said, I'm not going to be there. Why were they coming preparing to see a dead body when he said, I'm going to be alive? We were in the midst of this series that we end today in the book of Mark. We've called it Being Just Like Jesus. And as we get to Mark chapter 16, I'm reminded as I've studied through this book, there's at least 3 times in the book of Mark where Jesus made it very clear that he was going to come back from the dead. Mark chapter 9, verse 31. Jesus says this, the Son of Man, referring to himself, is going to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him. And when he is killed, after 3 days, he will rise. He said something very similar to that in Mark chapter 9, verse 9. He said something again about it in Mark chapter 10, verse 34. That he would not stay dead, but that he would rise again, victorious over sin, over death, and the grave. Yet these women came to the tomb expecting to see Jesus' body when he wasn't going to be there. Why does something like that happen? And I think the reason that it happens is that too often in life, and this is certainly what's happening here, if we let circumstances tell us there is defeat when actually victory is possible. And it'd be real easy to look at these women and go, oh, I can't believe it. You guys showed up at the tomb with spices, and Jesus said he was going to be there. Well, before we get too hard on the women, let's just say this. At least they showed up. The book of John chapter 20, verse 19 tells us about the 11 remaining disciples. They don't even show up at the tomb at first. Why? Because John tells us they're hiding. They're afraid. They're not engaging from the victory that Jesus had told them they were going to have. The truth was, victory had already occurred, yet in that moment, they were choosing to live in a way that didn't reflect victory. They allowed circumstances to dictate something that Jesus did not say. And I think there are times in our life where we can all relate, where we're allowing circumstances to contradict the truth about who Jesus is and the resurrection so that we don't have victory in our lives. So here's something that we cannot miss. If we don't make this connection from the gospel, if we don't make this connection from Resurrection Sunday, if we don't make this connection from the good news, we're missing something. The resurrection reminds us that circumstances are irrelevant when Jesus is involved. He created this world, he put it together, and so no matter what circumstances say, if it's in conflict with what Jesus has said, we can trust Jesus instead of circumstances. However, there are many times I think in my life and maybe yours as well that we hear something like this and we have this sort of like, yeah, but moment. The yeah, but moment that says it sounds good, but I can't really see it. Which brings us to another truth. Victory is happening even when we don't see it, folks. Do you know, two of the more challenging parts of my life have been around construction. One, getting this building together. And by the way, I'm so excited to even have some people in there. We were supposed to have our first Easter service a year ago in here, and it was going to look a whole lot different. It doesn't. It was hard, it's challenging. God is still blessing. But the other really challenging part of my life was about 21 years ago. Before I was getting ready to marry my wife, I decided that what I would do in the state that I lived in, you could do this, I would be the general contractor in building my own house. I learned a lot of lessons there. One of the things that I realized is that you probably shouldn't go into building a house like this when you were living on such a razor-thin margin of error. And it went really good for a good amount of time until I ran into one contractor that really messed me up. In fact, they left with half of my money. They didn't finish the job, and I was failing inspections. It paused the construction process for over 3 months. And in the midst of this 3 months, I'm going back to Jesus like, Jesus, you got to show up here. Because I'm literally going to be a modern-day example of that parable of the guy who built a tower and didn't consider its cost, and now it is sitting unfinished, except I'm going to have an unfinished house and a bankrupt bank account. I was overwhelmed by anxiety. I couldn't see where Jesus was working and what Jesus was doing. I only felt the difficulty and the pain and the silence in that moment. Fast forward, I don't have time to tell you the whole story, but at the end of the story, something had happened where I discovered a program I didn't know about before. It became available, and all of that sort of things happened that when it was all said and done, I paid less for my house and less for a month because of the delay than I did if I wouldn't have been in the delay. See, there's a moment between Good Friday and Resurrection Sunday that we call Silent Saturday. And in Silent Saturday, we often wonder what is going on. But you got to wonder what the disciples thought. You got to wonder what the women thought in that moment, so that when they showed up at the tomb and they got there, the stone was rolled away. And I say this every year, but we need to be reminded of this every year. The stone was not rolled away to let Jesus out, but to let us see in. And when they saw in, what they discovered was this, that Jesus had been doing some behind-the-scenes work. In fact, other parts of Scripture let us in a little bit on some of the behind-the-scenes things that happened between Friday and Sunday that we don't have time to get in today, but I just want to say this. Here's the truth. The resurrection reminds us of this fact, that Jesus is fighting for us. He fought for us then, and by the way, even if you're sitting in Silent Saturday, he is fighting for you now. I have to remind myself of this often. I remind you today, it may sound like something that like, he's going to say this again, but I'm going to say it again. The resurrection of Jesus Christ assures us that even if we do not see God at work, it doesn't mean that God is not working. The good news of the gospel is that Jesus came and took our punishment and gave us a way back to God. And God the Father is not going to send Jesus here. Jesus isn't going to come here and go through all that he went through, such that in the midst of your Silent Saturday, we begin to think or believe that something isn't true. He is working. He is doing things. He is making a victory even when death seems to have won. Don't miss that. This is something else the resurrection promises us, helps us know. And it's a connection in the midst of our Silent Saturday moments. Many of us that are thinking about right now that's going on in our life, these unresolved circumstances, the hardness, the things you don't understand. God, are you working? Jesus, are you working? The resurrection reminds us, even though we may not see it, he is. Here's another thing. When we think about the resurrection and the victory that comes from the resurrection, we need to know that victory is available for everyone. Now, I'm about to say something that seems really obvious, but I need to say it anyway. You ready? Here it is. Dead is dead. Dead is dead. Despite what the Princess Bride may actually try to tell us. Now, for those of you who are unaware of what the Princess Bride is, I'm praying for you. It's kind of like 80s music. You need to know what it is. But about 1987 or so, a movie came out, and it was really, really popular, and people still quote it today and that sort of thing. And it was around two people, Wesley and Princess Buttercup, and it was their love story. And there's some friends involved in it as well. And at one point, Wesley is taken to a guy named Miracle Max by his friend, Inigo Montoya. Just get it out of your system right now. My name is Inigo Montoya. You kill my father, prepare to die. Moving on. So he takes him to Miracle Max. And Miracle Max tells him this. When Inigo Montoya brings Wesley, he's saying there, he goes, good for you, he's mostly dead. And mostly dead isn't all dead. If he's mostly dead, he's still partially alive. If he's all dead, there's nothing you can do. And Inigo Montoya says, what can you do? Well, the only thing you can do, he says, Miracle Max, is to go through his pockets and look for loose change, right? That's Miracle Max. Wasn't a pretty looking dude, played by Billy Crystal. But I look at this and I laugh and I think, you're like, what in the world does Princess Bride and Mostly Dead have anything to do with the resurrection? Have you ever wondered why 3 days? I mean, if dead is dead, why 3 days? I mean, couldn't it have been 48 hours? Could have been 24 hours. Could have been 26 hours. I mean, dead is dead. We all recognize that, right? But one of the important things we need to understand when we look at this story is that God the Father and Jesus understood that there were roadblocks in the ways of people's beliefs back then and today as well. And one of those roadblocks was this, is that the ancients and many Jewish people as well believed this, that when you died, your soul was separated from your body, but it hovered around your body for up to 3 days. Until then, you were mostly dead. And then if you came back, boom, it was a miracle, but it wasn't like being all dead. Follow me? So when there was a delay, not because Jesus was mostly dead, dead is dead, but when there was a delay of 3 days, the reason the delay was so significant is because it was overcoming some of those obstacles that got in the way. And here's the truth. Well, I imagine most all of us in our life believe dead is dead. We do have some lies that we believe, like mostly dead. And it works like this. We think things like, this victory is not available to me because I've done too many bad things. I submit to you Moses, David, and Paul, the apostle. Moses, murderer. David, murderer and more. Paul, murderer of many. Yet Scripture calls Moses the greatest apostle or the greatest prophet in the Old Testament. It calls David a man after God's own heart. And Scripture, we know, is using Paul through the Holy Spirit to give us half of the New Testament. I don't know what you've done, but no matter what you might have thought was bad enough or too bad, you can never do too many bad things that the good news of the gospel can't overcome. So maybe it's just for special people, people who have pastor in front of their names. Not true. If you think I'm special, have a conversation with my wife. That'll be dispelled very fast. Well, maybe it sounds good, but you know, in this world, if it's good, sometimes it's too good to be what? True. But that's not how the gospel works. Listen, I would hate for any of us to come in online or to join us in this room today and not understand the most basic, the most important thing that the gospel teaches us, and this is it. That every single one of us have messed it up, we've blown it up and screwed it up. We have sinned. And when we sin, we are separated from God. It started thousands of years ago with Adam and Eve. When Adam and Eve sinned and chose their own way instead of God's ways, it separated us from God, and we weren't in a relationship with Him anymore. However, some thousands of years ago, Jesus at that very moment came alongside God the Father, and they initiated the plan to change what would have been the natural outcome of our sin. And this is what the plan was. Jesus was going to come to this earth. He's going to be born of the Virgin Mary. He's going to live a spotless, sinless life. He was going to die a sinner's death on that day we call Good Friday on the cross, and he was going to pay the penalty of our sin that we couldn't pay ourselves. And then he was going to rise victorious over sin, death, and the grave, so that every single person who chooses to believe on that truth will be put back into relationship with God. That's the good news. That's the gospel. And if you do not know that, It's not enough just to like a story, know a story, love a story, but to engage what this story means when it comes to being back in a relationship with God. And so right now, if you're in this room and you've accepted that, you've never accepted that to be true in your life, maybe you've heard it, but you never just embraced it, all you have to say, God, that is true. I believe that. I accept that. There's no magical words. God knows your heart. You could say magical words and not believe them, and God would know it's not true. It's about in your heart. And so if in this room today, this is you and this is the first time, here's what I'm asking you to do. Take a moment on the way out today. Take that handout you were given. Just write your name on some part of it. Put your phone number, put your email, and drop it off in the box on the way out. We want to follow up with you. You're like, Brian, I don't want to do that because this may be my first time I've done that, but it's not my first time I've heard it, and I'm kind of embarrassed. Don't be embarrassed. Don't be embarrassed. We want all of us to be walking in that relationship and the victory that comes from God, our Father. As well, if you're online right now and you've never heard this before, or you've heard it for the first time and it's engaging you in a way that never has before, and you want to accept that truth, can I encourage you, just write the word victory somewhere in the chat box, or send a private message to the person who's walking us through online today in this service, because we want you to know that it is a gift available to you. You can't earn it. By grace are you saved through faith. It says you don't have to do anything. God offers it, and that's the thing you can't miss. Victory is a gift He is offering to each of us. I hope you know that. And I imagine that most of us do. But there's something else that we can't miss. Here it is. While victory on the cross guarantees our eternal destiny with Jesus, we can also have moments when we're not living from victory in our circumstances. Eternal victory is permanent. Daily victory is conditional. Verse 8, I haven't read yet. It's an interesting verse. Here's how it goes. And they, the women, went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had seized them. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. In that moment, they had just heard about the greatest thing that's ever happened in all of mankind's living, the victory that happens from Jesus Christ. They were given a command, go and tell people. And their first response after engaging victory and given a command to go tell people is to do the exact opposite. I think there are times in life where we intellectually know a truth, but when we try to live it out, it doesn't come out exactly right. In fact, it might be really easy to look at these women and draw a conclusion like, oh, I can't believe that they did that. I mean, how could they not live from the great victory that they had just heard about and experienced? Well, I think we could ask ourselves all that question over the past year. Ever had a moment in the past year where you feel like that you know about the victory of Jesus Christ, but it isn't real in your life? You ever had a moment where the anxiety, you have a moment where the unknown, you ever had a moment where the difficult, the hard, and the challenging has begun to dictate how you're living instead of the victory that Jesus provided for us that day when He rose again? Have you had that moment where circumstances are telling you something, but those circumstances should be irrelevant when Jesus is involved? Here's the thing, though. Just because we've had those scenarios, just because the women had a scenario like that, it doesn't mean we have to stay that way. It doesn't. Mark's an interesting book. Mark is very just sort of abrupt in the way that it's written, and so it doesn't give us more background to what happened to the women after this section of Scripture. But fortunately, we have some other Gospels that sort of fill in some blanks for us. Because while Mark ends abruptly, we know from the book of Matthew chapter 28 that these women, while first they didn't live from this victory that was available for them, eventually and quickly, they do exactly what they asked. See, why do I bring that up? Because this is what it means for us. That means there's also hope for you and for me. Even when we mess it up, we blow it up, and we screw it up. Listen, I was at home the other day, and I heard my youngest from downstairs. I think he was playing a video game, and from downstairs he just yells, I messed it up, I blew it up, and I screw it up. Honestly, I think he was poking fun of me. I don't think it had anything to do with sin, but I was just like, I'm glad he's listening. Listen, Every single one of us has messed it up and blown it up and screwed it up. And culture wants to tell us because that has happened, we're finished. But this is the truth around the resurrection. The resurrection assures us just because we failed doesn't mean we are finished. Just because we messed it up, screwed it up, or blown it up doesn't mean we're cast aside. Doesn't mean that there's still not hope. Doesn't mean that we can't live from the power of the resurrection daily in our lives. You see, eternal victory is permanent. Daily victory is conditional. And it's available to all of us if we choose to believe. Because we gather together today on this 4th of April, 2021, right here in this room, online and with people throughout the world, to remember the truth of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. That 2,000 years ago, yes, he was dead and crucified, but 3 days later, he overcame death. He overcame sin. He overcame the grave to bring victory to all of us who believe on him, all of us who accept Jesus for that payment for our sin, who accept Jesus as the one who can put us back in relationship with God because of what he's done. This is the good news. This is the gospel. This is the victory he accomplished for you. And he accomplished for me. He is risen. He is risen indeed.